is going on out there, everybody? And thanks again for joining us here on Expanded Perspectives. With me, the COVID kid, and joining me, as always, a Big Fizzy.
How's it going, everybody? Yes, I'm here in Skeleton Studios. Pretty excited about today's show, man.
Me too.
We got a really interesting guest on today. You know, we don't do a whole lot of interviews. What do you think? We do 4 or 5 a year? Not as many as we used to.
Not as many as we used to, yeah.
Normally, we just cover the subjects ourselves. And I know we've covered this subject before. But a couple of weeks ago, I want to say, well, more than a couple weeks ago. I want to say a couple months ago.
Or longer.
It
was probably even back before. It was back before, it was around Thanksgiving when I think it was when I found it.
I think you're right. Well, at some point ago, regardless.
I'll look while you're telling the story.
Cam was, because we listen to lots of other podcasts because, we're on our own a lot. And he had mentioned a guest that Greg Carlwood had on his show. And I was like, no, I'm not familiar with it. He's like, man, you need to check it out. I know you're a big DB Cooper fan. I was like, all right, cool. So, I downloaded it. I listened to it. And I was blown away by this. There's a guy that has his own podcast dedicated to the DB Cooper case named Darren Schaefer. And his podcast is called the Cooper Vortex. And I messaged him and he agreed to come on. And so that's who we're going to have on today's show. There's not going to be any news, folks. We talked to Darren for an hour, and I think you're going to really enjoy this. If you like the DB Cooper mystery or you're fans of, conspiracies and things like that, this has to be one of my favorites. Is, did he get away with the money? Did he die when he jumped out of the plane? No one knows. The FBI, they never found out anything, and he changed the rules forever. I mean, back when this happened in 1971, you could go to the counter and just buy a ticket. No security.
Right.
Nothing. That's how he was able to get on with the bomb. Nowadays.
Smoke cigarettes and drink whiskey in the back without even having your seatbelt buckled.
Yeah, the good old days.
The good old days.
Right? So,
I miss those days smoking on planes.
Yeah. And drinking and having the flight attendants light the cigarettes for you.
Right?
Yeah. Who doesn't?
International man of mystery.
Yeah. Anyways, well, let's get right into that. Let's take a break. And when we get back from that break, we're going to be talking to Darren Schaefer of the Cooper Vortex. You're listening to Expanded Perspectives. Well, hey, folks, we've got a really interesting show for you all today with a very special guest who's going to be speaking with us today about one of our favorite mysteries. What I'm talking about is the only unsolved hijacking case in the history of commercial aviation. We're going to be talking about DB Cooper. And joining us today is a guy who probably knows more about this subject than anyone else you're going to run across. He's a researcher and a host of an incredible podcast called what else? The Cooper Vortex. Calling in from beautiful Denver, Colorado, Mr. Darren Schaefer. How's it going, Darren?
Great, guys. Thanks for having me on.
Absolutely, man. This is a real treat because this is one of those mysteries that I've always been fascinated about because it's unique in so many ways. I guess to start out, what got you interested in pursuing this stuff?
The first thing that got me just interested in the case was the fact that I lived in Woodland, Washington, which is just, right in the drop zone there. So it was just a local story, something interesting. And then I ended up with this book, Skyjack by Jeffrey Gray. Oh. And I read that book and it really sent me down a rabbit hole. Skyjack sort of leads you into the blast. So I got that book next, and then Bruce Smith's DB Cooper and the FBI. And then I ended up shortly after that, coincided with me changing careers a little bit. And I ended up with a job where I worked by myself the entire week. Mm-hmm. And I could go literally weeks without talking to another human being at work. So I listened to a lot of podcasts and talk radio, and I started searching for DB Cooper stuff. And there were a bunch of different shows that had done an episode on DB Cooper. And so I just started consuming them. And they all tended to be the same thing. It was a couple of hosts discuss the case. They tell you the entire hijacking in 20 minutes. And then they spend 10 minutes discussing 3 suspects. And then the 3 hosts pick one of the suspects and they solve the case. I listened to so many that I just has started skipping their explanation of the hijacking. And just so I could go to hear their opinion on different suspects and things.
Right.
But what I really wanted was I wanted to hear from the people who wrote these books I was reading. I wanted to talk to some of the people that were on the forums and were debating this every day. I mean, I knew there was this community of people there. I want to hear what they have to say. And so I just decided, you know what, I will put together that show. And I reached out. That was my plan. With no experience in podcasting or doing anything like that, I reached out to a few people and I thought, if I could get 2 of these 5 people to agree to be on my show that doesn't exist, then I'll do it. And I reached out to them and all 5 of them were like, yeah, when do you want to do it?
Right? Man, your story is so similar to ours. Just real quick, I didn't know that a part of your background is like me and Cam were the same way. We had jobs, and we still do, where we are by ourselves all the time, by ourselves, like you were mentioning. That's how we started finding out about podcasting, was we were listening to a lot of talk shows and podcasts. And much like you said, I mean, like we were just burning through the material. That's what led us to decide to try to do one. And we were the exact same way. We're like, there's no way any of these authors are going to come on, but what can it hurt? We're going to email them. And sure enough, you'd be surprised how many are like, well, yeah, I'd love to come on.
Oh, yeah. You know, if it's something someone's passionate about talking about, even I think the idea of being on some indie podcast or something is appealing.
Yeah.
So I think people do kind of look for that, especially authors whose books have been out quite a while, you know, because they're always looking to sell a couple more copies and they want people to read their book. So yeah, they'll come on your show about vintage hula hoops to promote their book or something.
Right.
Well, I got to throw this in here, Darren. Look, we're guilty of the same thing, of talking about DB in the same way, because really, and I'm thankful for it now, for your podcast, is I had no idea that there were the level or number of suspicious people and suspects involved in this case. I really thought it was one of those things that, like everybody does, it's Kyle and I even equated it to the Amelia Earhart, is you think it's one story, you kind of get the story down. There was a hijacking, the guy jumped. That's really all we know. They never did really track it all down. And then I started listening to yours, and I listened to it a while back, and then I stopped, and then I've gone back. So I may have listened to every episode now that you've done, and it has done nothing but, like everything else in this circle of madness that we all discuss, it's left me with more questions than answers. It is unbelievable how deep you dig, and just the people you get. I'm blown away by it, and I'm sure you must be blown away by the same thing. Was it overwhelming when you opened that book up and realized, oh man, there are a lot of threads to this?
At times it is, because I'll start to go down some thread and realize that it goes a long, long ways. And I've done this so many times now. It's like, do I want to pursue that? Do I want to get involved with this?
Yeah. Right. Well, for the uninitiated, for those living under a rock, could you give us the quick Cliff Notes version of what transpired on November 21st, 1971? And then we can start getting into some of the suspects and things like that.
Yeah, absolutely. So a dude in a business suit walks into the Portland International Airport, buys a one-way ticket to Seattle. The total for the ticket, including tax and everything, is $20. He pays with cash. And the ticket agent asks his name. He gives his name as Dan Cooper. He boards the plane. Shortly after takeoff, he hands a stewardess a note. She puts it in her pocket and walks away. She assumes it was just another businessman hitting on her. So she comes back again. He tugs on her shoulder and says, "Miss, I think you better have a look at that note. I have a bomb." So she reads the bomb. He's hijacking the plane. He doesn't want the passengers to know. And then he wants $200,000 and 4 parachutes ready on the ground when they land in Seattle. They land in Seattle. He gets his parachutes and his cash. He lets the passengers off the plane. He wants to be flown to Mexico City. And then he has some very specific flight instructions for the plane. He wants the flaps set to 15 degrees, the cabin depressurized, the landing gear down, and the plane to be flown at 10,000 feet. Under those conditions, the pilots say it can't make it to Mexico City. Also, interestingly, he wanted to take off with the landing gear down. He hijacked a 727, which has an aft staircase. And the pilots refused to take off with it down, saying it was dangerous. So he said, fine, whatever, I'll lower it in the air. Well, they called in to air traffic control and said, hey, can this plane fly with the aft stairs down? Because the pilots didn't know. And no one there knew either. So they called Boeing. And Boeing said, yes, actually, that plane can fly with the rear stairs down. It's well documented. It's been proven. And so since it can't make it to Mexico City, they agree on a refueling stop in Reno. The plane takes off. He lowers the rear air stairs and jumps out somewhere before Reno and is never seen again. The plane lands in Reno and he is not on board. The only thing he left behind was a black clip-on tie and 8 cigarette butts.
Man, yeah. And that's just the beginning. I mean, you think that that's a pretty cool story, but then it gets even crazier. Like, there's just so many things, like the lost evidence. Like a lot of the stuff was lost. Some of the evidence that the FBI was collecting or had collected and was going to, maybe look at in a future date was lost.
Well, it actually wasn't lost because so many documents have been released from the FBI and are still being released. There was a document that Bill Rawlins actually found and pointed out to me that said to examine the cigarette butts when they arrived for any clues or any potential evidence, and then when you're done, to throw them in the garbage.
Huh. And wasn't one of the FBI agents that was, working on that, wasn't he killed under mysterious circumstances as well?
Not an FBI agent. It was one of the guys who packed. This is where I'm even confused on the details myself because they're so heavily debated. So if I misspeak about something, then you'll just have to forgive me because I've read so many different accounts on this. But you're referring to Earl Cossey, and he was either the man who packed the parachutes or one of the parachutes and delivered them, or just the guy who packed them. But he sort of became like a liaison to the parachuting world, to the FBI, and sort of wanted to be the contact. I think kind of enjoyed the attention to be asked about DB Cooper. But he was killed at his house. Like somebody beat him over the head. He was standing in his driveway. His garage door was open, and he had his wallet on him and everything. Nothing was taken.
Right.
And that's unsolved to this day.
Right. Speaking of DB Cooper, now he wasn't calling himself DB. Is that correct? That was a mistake?
Right. He gave his name as Dan Cooper, and then it went out over the air. One of the reports said it was D.A. Cooper, and then a newspaper printed it as DB Cooper. There was a DB Cooper in the Portland area who was a prior convicted felon. And so just by giving that name, he was one of the first people they went and asked. And, obviously that dude didn't pull off the hijacking. So there was just some sort of mix up there, and it stuck. I think the name DB Cooper is way cooler anyways than Dan Cooper. Right.
And he was supposed to be around 6'1", 170 pounds, mid 40s, olive complexion. But what I like about part of the story is how cool, calm, and collected he seemed. Like he never, according even to the stewardesses or the flight attendants, like he wasn't yelling, he wasn't cursing. I mean, he was very calm, just sitting in the back, sipping on a whiskey and Coke, and having the flight attendants light his cigarettes for him.
100%. They even said that he was polite. They said he was thoughtful because he requested meals for the flight crew as part of his instruction. They weirdly only kind of had nice things to say about the guy that was going to blow him up.
And they even, didn't he try to, in one of the stories, give one of them some money?
Yeah.
He's actually going to share a little with them.
When Tina Mucklow brought the money onto the plane, he's opening the bag to look at it, and she's kind of standing right there. You know, she just brought it to him. And she looks down and she's like, whoa, that's a lot of money. And so he just grabs a stack of the money and hands it to her. And he had tried to tip her for her drink earlier, and she said she couldn't accept gratuity. So she makes the same joke, you know, with a couple $1,000. I'm sorry, I can't accept gratuity.
He was just handing it out.
And which seems like odd behavior for
somebody, a man stealing, needing the money.
Hijacking the money, who's actually been paid the ransom. He's just giving it away. I mean, it's so odd on so many levels. And like the amount, the $200,000, I mean, that's just an odd amount to ask for. It's almost like he knew that was an amount that they would have, the airlines would have on hand.
That is possible. I've seen reports that the airlines sort of had, or maybe it wasn't the airlines, either the airlines or the FBI, there was like $250,000 on hand in cash for such a situation. And he requested $200,000. So that is interesting. Did he know about that?
Right. It seems that way. And why do you think he asked for 4 parachutes instead of just asking for 1?
Well, it's obvious why, because if he asks for 1, the odds that they're going to do something to his parachute, especially in 71, if give me 1 parachute, they'll pull the ripcord and then nothing will happen. And then they'll just laugh. Oh, yep, he killed himself. But if you ask for 4 parachutes, or he asks for 2 sets, a main chute and a reserve, one of each. And so if he does that, they can only assume that there's a chance he'll take a hostage. And if they sabotage both chutes, then the FBI just murdered a hostage.
You can't even sabotage one because it's just the odds are too great that something could happen to that one and it not be him. Yeah.
And there was even differences in the parachutes. Like some were military, some were more sporting, I think.
That's correct. The 2 main chutes, you had a military parachute and then a sport parachute. I think it's Paracommander was the other one. And he chose the military chute. And when Tina Mucklow is going back into the cockpit after the plane had taken off, she turns around and sees him putting the parachute on and comments that it looked like he had done that many times before.
Yeah, because he probably had. I mean,
of course.
Obviously, this is not somebody who's attempting this for the very first time. It seems well thought out. I mean, even down to the day it happened on, was it the night before Thanksgiving? So a lot of people that were probably off because of the holiday, he knew that. He factored that in. The amount
I totally agree with that.
Right? The amount of money he asked for, he knew would be there. It would be a reasonable request. He knew to ask for multiple parachutes for that very reason, so it would weed out any sabotage by the FBI. Also, I'm trying to think of some other things that he did that it just seemed. Oh, the 727's ability to fly with the aft stairwell down. The pilots that flew the plane didn't know it was possible. The people in the control tower didn't know. They had to call Boeing. I mean, how would this DB Cooper seem to know everything?
Right. And there's no internet in 1971. And how many local libraries had the flight operation manual for that specific aircraft?
Right.
Well, and I also like the fact of where he wanted it rerouted to when he flew. So he knew it would take him over the drop zone, and he knew how long he had before he could have to get out, because he wasn't in a hurry. And then all of a sudden he was, and it was just like certain things they discuss as you're like, man, this had been plotted out deep. And this isn't just, like you said, this isn't just a guy just winging it. Like, I think I can pull this off. This is somebody that had not only done a lot of this before, but was extremely comfortable with it and very well planned. I will tell you this, Darren, this is something that I had no idea until your podcast, because I always wondered about the name Dan Cooper. I'm like, why would you just give him I couldn't think of just an average everyday name when they're like, what's your name? Dan Cooper. Until you brought up a French comic book. That is the craziest lead, and it makes sense.
It does make sense.
That's the worst part about it, is it makes a lot of sense when you start thinking of military men in that era. or at least in their prime. So if you'd have been 20 years before that, then you would think, oh, if this guy looks like he's in his 40s, if he was 18 years old, there's a really good chance of where they would have been whenever they were first doing their military stint.
A lot of people have tried to pursue that. But trying to figure out who D.B. Cooper was from the Dan Cooper comic book that's impossible.
It's impossible, but it's just so weird that there is a comic book about such a person, such a character named Dan Cooper, and that he is like a skydiving superhero of sorts, like a super spy, I guess is what he was meant to be, or some sort of Captain French or whatever he's meant to be, named Dan Cooper, and that this is what almost like a recreation, like art imitating life or life imitating art.
Exactly. It's too on the nose to be a coincidence. I've said on my show a bunch of times, there's an unlimited amount of male names you can give. And to land on one that's the name of a comic book about a daredevil skydiving hero seems pretty unlikely. And I've asked almost all my guests, do you think that he chose that name based on the comic book? And almost all of them say yes.
Yeah, it would make sense.
It just makes too much sense. It fits too well for, like we said, for it to be a coincidence. And I'll tell you something else that I really appreciate is the fact that how confident those people you interview are that it's their loved one or their person of interest that's D.B. Cooper. They are ride or die when they put their ideas on here. I've listened to some where those guys are like, no, everybody else is crazy. And every author is like, nope, I think it's my guy. And here's why it's my guy. So I have to ask you about this doing the show that Kyle and I do about the strange and unusual. Is the name William Wolfgang Gossett?
I did a show with his son.
Exactly.
Greg Gossett.
And so that's why that guy seems to, can you share some of his background and why he seems to fit into there? Because there's more, but I like him as well.
I like Gossett as well. He had some military experience. He was in Vietnam. He was big into survivalism and going outdoors. His son said, Greg, that growing up, they would just drop his dad off in the woods and then go pick him back up a couple of days later. It's just something he enjoyed doing for fun. He also was a radio host, a paranormal investigator, a priest, kind of a slippery con artisty guy. Even his son Greg didn't have that nice of things to say about him. Going so far as saying, he wasn't a great father. He's a pretty interesting suspect. He confessed to Greg and Greg's brother to being D.B. Cooper. And then he also confessed to two different lawyers to tell his story. And there's some even crazier details than that. But another researcher started looking into him, Galen Cook. And then that sort of just disappeared, and Galen doesn't seem to be interested in coming on the show. He doesn't want to give out any of his information before his book comes out. But we're looking at over 10 years now
that he's been working on following this one down.
Yeah.
Well, and I was fascinated with the fact that they were talking about, I believe it was him saying that he took his Gossett's one of his other sons, I think his older son, and they went to Canada, supposed to go on a fishing trip. Wasn't that him?
Yes.
And then he had told his
older brother they were going to go on this fishing trip. He told his mom, the parents were separated, so it was a big deal. And then they end up driving straight to Canada and then driving straight back to Utah, which is quite a drive.
Yeah, and after what'd he say? He put him in the room. He said, I'll be back in 2 hours. And he left with a black bag, and then he comes back and he goes, get your stuff, we're going home. The bag was gone.
What a fishing trip with Dad.
And the bag was, now is Gossett the same that said if they was, this would be a good place for D.B. Cooper to have left some money?
The safety deposit box in Vancouver, BC?
No, the one where they found it like in a creek in the river. The few $1,000s.
Dwayne Weber supposedly brought Joe Weber back to the spot.
That's the other one. And there's another one.
Dwayne Weber is an interesting one, and I've sort of gone back and forth on him at times because Joe Weber, his wife that he confessed to on his deathbed, he said, "I'm Dan Cooper." And she didn't know what that meant. So she goes to her library and searches for Dan Cooper, finds a book on D.B. Cooper, and I believe it was Max Gunther's book, D.B. Cooper, What Really Happened. And she sees her dead husband's handwriting in the margins on the book. And she checks the book out and reads it, learns all about Dan Cooper. And then she spent the rest of her life, she's still alive as far as I'm aware, pursuing the fact that her husband was D.B. Cooper.
Really?
And pushing it and getting on these internet boards and arguing with people constantly. And she went on trips to look for evidence. And her story's been very malleable. You know, as things have come out, she's had, she could just explain it into Dwayne's story right away. Even some things that come out, it's like not true. She'll fit it into Dwayne's story somehow, and then it's disproven, and then that doesn't matter because it wasn't true. But there are a few things. She started talking about this break-in at a store a couple miles south of the drop zone. Happened at like midnight, the night of the hijacking. A dude steals some gloves and some beef jerky, and then gloves, beef jerky, and then maybe a pack of cigarettes as well. And that's all that was stolen from that store. And she had brought that up, but people discounted it because it came from Joe Weber. Well, the FBI files come out and boom, there it is. There was a break-in at that store. That stuff was stolen. How did she know about that before everyone else?
Right.
And there's so many other suspects that have similar stories.
Yeah. So to back up just a little bit. So when they refueled and they took off again, and it was just DB in the back of the plane, the flight attendants and the pilots, they were all in the cockpit, correct?
Yes. He had all the passengers released,
right,
and most of the flight crew except for Tina Mucklow. She was going to stay on and be the sort of go-between between him and the flight crew in the cockpit.
Right. So they're not 100% exactly sure when he jumped. Was that correct? Because there was no one back in the fuselage to see him jump. Is that correct?
Correct. That's correct. The method they used to determine the drop zone was approximately between like 8:11 and 8:13, depending on which account and transcript you read. The pilot feels a pressure bump in the cabin and notices a slight oscillation in the aircraft. He reports that, makes a note of it, so they could determine where the plane was at that time. They determined where the plane was at that time, and then they took the same plane out over the ocean, put a 250-pound weight on the back of the rear stairs, and pushed it off to see if it would do the exact same thing, and it did. So they determined this is where he jumped.
I got you. So when they finally realized that he was no longer on the aircraft, he had jumped at some point. What did they start to do? Like, how long was it until they started like putting boots on the ground, searching for the guy?
Right away.
Right away.
When not at the drop zone, I'm sorry. When the plane touches down, agents raid the plane right away in Reno. They search the plane with dogs. I want to make a point of that because it does annoy me that I constantly have to answer this theory of what if he didn't jump out of the plane and hit on the plane? Well, there's not a bunch of spare empty space on planes if you've ever been on one. And they searched the plane with dogs and with people. He wasn't on the plane.
Right. That
was the end of my rant on that.
No, that's fine. I've never heard of him being theorized as a stowaway. So they begin searching, and I'm imagining, it's probably a very remote wooded area. What steps did they take in the next upcoming days and weeks to figure out what happened?
The next day, or as soon as the sun rose, they started flying that flight path with planes and helicopters, looking for a parachute, looking for anything they could find. Maybe there's a big, human-shaped splat on the ground somewhere.
Right.
So they just flew the flight path a couple of times. They actually had the SR-71 Blackbird cover the flight path also, back when the plane was like super top secret.
Wow.
And then it was almost 48 hours before they had people on the ground in the drop zone, because they had to figure out where he jumped.
Right.
And then they had a bunch of people on the ground looking, going door to door. Have you seen anyone? Then the weather turns in that area. And in thick woods plus 2 feet of snow, you're not going to find anything. So the search resumed in the spring. They had, I want to say it was 300 people, National Guardsmen, Sheriff's Department, a bunch of other volunteers, literally just start stomping through the woods. And they did that for 3 or 4 days. And the only thing they found was a skeleton of late teenage, early 20s gal who had gone missing a few years prior.
Oh, wow. Yeah, because I've heard theories that he didn't just walk out of the woods, that he had like stashed a dirt bike or something like that in the woods, or somebody had come pick him up.
Stashed the dirt bike one. The only other time I've heard that is, I'm not sure if I'm pronouncing his first name correctly, Chael Sonnen.
Oh, maybe
MMA
maybe that's where I heard it from. Yeah, it's possible. I've been following this story for so long, I kind of forget where I hear things. But that's definitely possible. I remember him talking about that on Joe's show.
Yeah, and he recently spoke about it. I guess he has his own podcast and spoke about it at length, maybe for 10 minutes or so. And a bunch of people sent me that right away, like, oh, hey, check this out. And I listened to it, and he sort of gives all these vague clues, like he used to race motorcycles, and he was Native American, and he went to high school with my mom. So me and 2 other guys tried to figure out exactly who he was talking about. Mm-hmm. And we weren't able to come up with the exact person we think he's talking about, but I'm not a big believer in his story.
Yeah, I've heard. I'm not from Washington, but I can only imagine up there that like everybody's aunt or uncle claims that they knew DB Cooper, or, oh yeah, that was my cousin's dad. I mean, it just seems like everybody has their own version of the story.
Oh yeah, I've spoken to probably well over 100 people that knew him.
Right? I don't know why. It's because it's getting one over on the man. It's for whatever reason, or if it's like, like Robin Hood, where people, they have all these claims where they want to be associated with DB Cooper. Why do you think that is?
Oh, absolutely. And even on a 2nd and 3rd and 4th degree level, like, hey, my uncle was the guy who marched through the woods looking for DB Cooper, or my grandpa's best friend's neighbor was involved in that case and he gave him advice on what boots to wear. It's just ridiculous. I don't know what the urge is for people to want to be involved in that. I guess it would be attention. Is the coolest thing you have going on the fact that your uncle was neighbors with DB Cooper?
Right? It just seems that way. Like everybody wants to be associated. I guess because the guy was like James Bond. He seemed like a really cool person. I've also heard, tales of it was an inside job, that somebody in the CIA or FBI actually perpetrated it on the agency itself. Have you heard of stuff like that?
Oh, I've definitely heard of stuff like that. Howard Hunt of the Watergate scandal. There was a book written by Nat LaFoque that points to Howard Hunt as being DB Cooper. And as ridiculous as that sounds, it's not bad. It's not a bad theory. And it's better than some others. And, he did pull off some crazy stuff. He was writing spy novels. I mean, he did that break-in at the psychiatrist's office. He did some crazy stuff, and I think he did kind of want to be a James Bond superhero kind of guy and do that kind of stuff.
He even kind of looks like him.
Yeah, and he wore sunglasses during the hearing at Watergate.
There's even been stories where not just men, but women have come forward claiming that they were D.B. Cooper, like Barbara Dayton.
Yes, I love that story so much. I reached out to the Foremans who had written the book about her, and I thought it was ridiculous. I thought that theory just seemed so far-fetched. And then I met the Foremans, and they were the nicest, most honest people and couldn't have been more kind to me. And I learned, kind of in dealing with all these other theories and things, or with people who might have a crazy theory, they are telling the truth. If they believe they are telling the truth. And in their case, it was this Barb Dayton who had told them this story. So they believe their friend Barb. But anyways, Barb was born Robert Dayton, was the first person to get gender reassignment surgery in Washington State in 1969. Then she sort of gets bummed out. Her life's not going the way she thought it would be going. So she decides she wants to prove she's still a badass. So she dresses back up as a dude, hijacks the plane, bails out of the plane, basically throws the money away because it wasn't about the money. It was just about proving that she was a badass, and then continues her life as a woman. And they never found D.B. Cooper because they were looking for a man.
I like that. I like that story.
And there's some interesting things with that too. I mean, she was this badass merchant marine and like prisoner of war in, the Philippines. Don't quote me on that. She was a prisoner of war overseas someplace. And then in a biker gang, she supposedly murdered someone. She was wild. And when the foreman started investigating some of the other wild claims, they all checked out. So
there's a chance.
Was she lying about the D.B. Cooper thing, but then telling the truth about all of the other stuff?
That's what's so wild about all of these suspects is and I'm sure you've talked to some people, and while you're talking, you're like, there's no way that's going to be, they're going to be a suspect. Like, it just doesn't work. And then you listen to some, and then like we've discussed, next thing you know is you have 25 or 30 that you're like, yeah, there's a chance that person could have been D.B. Cooper also.
Oh, yeah. I'm literally finding new suspects all the time. I just got this book. Oh, what's it called? Happy Valley, Mafia, Mormons, and Murder. And there's a chapter on D.B. Cooper in this book. And it's from 2004. And I had never heard about it. And it points to a new suspect that I'd never heard of.
Oh, here he goes.
Makes an interesting case for it. I reached out to the guy to see if he would be willing to be on my show, but it turns out that unfortunately he passed away 5 years ago. So I'm trying to figure out now how to get that story told on the show.
Was it ever proven if the bomb was real or not?
No, he took it with him. He cracks it open for the stewardess at one point. She said she saw a bunch of wires and 8 red sticks. Red sticks tend more to be road flares than dynamite. We debate. I ask every single guest, was the bomb real on the show? And the vast majority of them say no, bomb was not real. Why does it need to be real? Right. If you say to someone who has a bomb while you're in the air, prove it.
Yeah.
I mean, that's a ridiculous idea.
That's what you never tell somebody with a bomb.
Right. But I did just read this book by Shayna Roth. And unfortunately, I can't think of the name. It was True Crime Files by Shayna Roth, I think. But she's sort of made an interesting case that made me rethink that a little bit. I mean, I've been looking at this case for a very long time. And it's interesting that even just like her book, which wasn't really focused on Cooper, but had one chapter on it, could make me think a little bit differently about one aspect of the case. Because she does point out, what if somebody had said to him, prove it, let's see it, I don't think that's a bomb. Then he's in a really unfortunate and embarrassing position if it's not. Although we do know that he had a knife on him because the stewardess saw him cut a bunch of shroud lines out of one of the extra parachutes. So he did have a knife, but...
Well, he was probably prepared.
Well, I always think about, and I have since this whole time, is I still don't believe the bomb is real. I believe he may have fashioned it to look extremely real, but at the end of the day, as laid back as he was, he knew that the only trouble he would really get in if they called his bluff was passing off a note that said he had a bomb and a fake one. Nobody got hurt, and there was actually no way for it to hurt anybody. So it's probably another reason for, I'm not really worried about it. All it is like a couple of road flares and an alarm clock just to make them think. Because at that point, which one of those flight attendants would be smart enough or well-versed enough to know if he's telling the truth or not? They pull it out and it looks like a bomb. I mean, they're not bomb experts. They're just going to pull it out and be like, well, the guy that says he's got a bomb's got a bomb.
Yeah, I don't believe I would ever question someone on the authenticity of their bomb.
Negative. That's like saying, how sharp's your knife? Yeah, I'm like, I don't need to know that. That's something I don't need to know. I do like the fact, though, well, I do and I don't. I do like the fact that people were trying to throw, and this guy's, you talk about a wild card from society. Richard Floyd McCoy, that guy is something else. And they were trying to say that he was DB, but he wasn't even the right age for it. Like he's like in his early 20s when that went down, I believe, wasn't it?
Yeah, I want to say he was 28. 28 at the time of the hijacking. He committed a copycat hijacking 6-8 months after Cooper did, and did many of the same things. He had a note that he gave to them. He had a fake grenade and a handgun, and demanded $500,000, got it, jumped out of the plane, and was apprehended right away. They found all of his money, I think, except for $30, which he used to like buy lunch and get himself home from when he landed in the Utah desert.
Epic fail.
Yeah, and also he was arrested. This is there's a couple of suspects that get a lot of attention, except for when you really start to look into the case, they fall apart the fastest. And Richard Floyd McCoy is one of those. He was too young. He had ears that stuck out prominently, so that would be something you would say. This dude, he had big ears that stuck out. A very distinguishing feature. So did Dwayne Weber. And none of the stewardesses said the guy had big ears that stuck out. And also, Richard Floyd McCoy gets arrested. The FBI have him doing a similar hijacking. He does not confess to being D.B. Cooper, and the FBI found zero evidence to link him to the other hijacking, including all three stewardesses saying that it was not him. I'm not sure what more evidence we need that it wasn't him.
Yeah. But he was friends with another subject, or at least knew one of the other suspects, correct?
Two other suspects. One of them is this Utah dude that I'm working on putting together. So you'll have to tune into the Cooper Vortex.
I'm all over. Yeah, and the other one was Gossett, correct?
The
Gossett.
other one, it's possible he would have known Gossett. So they were both Mormon, living in Utah, and both would have had some military connections. So there's a bunch of circles that they could have both run in. I haven't seen any evidence directly linking the two.
And people have to keep in mind, this was 1971 in a small area, so there's not as large a population, and you're more likely to know people if you're into certain things. If you were a skydiver in 1970, you're going to know all the other skydivers within probably 100 miles of where you live.
I agree.
You know, we have to look at it differently because we think of it now. You may not know the people that live 2 houses down, but back then it was a whole different time. I'll tell you another one that I would like you to speak on, and I just get a kick out of it for what it is, and our listeners will know exactly, is there are a couple of young ladies claiming that it is Forrest Fenn was actually
Yes.
DB Cooper.
Yes. Forrest Finn, or possibly his brother. Their theory is not so certain on that, but he has some military experience, possibly some skydiving experience, and he comes across a large sum of money around the same time and starts this institute. He's the right age. They sort of look the same. It's interesting.
It's very interesting.
Yeah.
That whole link is one of those that nobody would think. It's almost like Forrest built a whole nother crazy persona to throw everybody off of who he really was, or the persona that he played for a couple hours.
Oh, yeah. And I really like they theorized that it's possible that there was some clue in the chest that would prove that he was Cooper. Maybe possibly a $20 bill from the hijacking or the airplane ticket or something like that.
Yeah.
But if the chest was really found, if the chest was real, it apparently wasn't in there.
Yeah. And there's one other I would like to ask you about, because this one was the one that I had saved simply because of the last name. And I want to talk to you about Marla Cooper.
Okay.
That one, she seems to be able to cross a lot of T's and dot a lot of I's speaking about her uncle LD.
He's a very interesting suspect. And their family was up to a lot of different things at the time to try and make a buck,
Yeah.
And he had the experience, and she said he had the Dan Cooper comic book. She remembers that Thanksgiving that he came back with her brothers and that he was kind of all beat up and hurt. And they said they had gone turkey hunting, I believe, and had gotten into a car accident. And just he was hurt.
And the way that she talks about it being false flags, and she starts getting into some real wild stuff with the FBI, and that he may have had handlers, and that there may have been more behind the scenes work. Like we talk about it being an inside job, but it might have been an inside job done without the inside really knowing type thing, to where they were getting someone from the outside and basically building them up to be able to do it. And then the fact that her uncle just vanished. Like when it started getting hot, he was gone, and then she never saw him again.
Yeah, exactly.
Like it was that story. I'm a big fan of Gossett. I'm a big fan of Bradley Collins, and him thinking that his dad was DB. But the Marla Cooper story, with her involvement with the FBI and her involvement at going and taking lie detector tests, and then apparently talking to her, and then around this time with more information, what was it, in 2016, they just now finally, I can't say closed the case, but suspended investigation?
Yeah, they suspended the investigation, so they are not actively pursuing the case at all. If you have a parachute or a $20 bill, then they're interested. But aside from that, they're not doing anything.
Now, in 1980, like a small boy did find some of the $20 bills. Is that correct?
Yes, in 1980, Brian Ingram and his family were out on Tina Bar on the Columbia River, and he brushed aside some sand with his arm to make a fire pit and stumbled across, at first, what he just thought was some garbage, and then picks it up, and it's these crumbling, deteriorating $20 bills. It still had the rubber bands on them. 3 stacks, approximately $5,800, one on top of the other, buried in the sand. The rubber bands were still on them. They started crumbling right away. They go home and wash the money and try to clean it up to figure out if they, could use it. Basically, you find some money. But then they end up contacting their local authorities because it could be DB Cooper's money. So they turned it in. Turns out it's DB Cooper's money. And that is really the only evidence that has been found since he jumped out of that plane. But unfortunately, it doesn't really answer any questions for us, because where it's found, it's like 19 miles from where the drop zone is. There isn't a good explanation for how the money could get there by traveling down a stream and then into the river to be dumped out. And there's been more research done on it lately. Tom Kay has looked at these diatoms on these bills, these little microorganisms that bloom essentially in the springtime. And what he's found on those bills tells him that the money did not go into the water in November. It went into the water in the springtime and was found. So the money wasn't even in the water until the spring of 79. So how did it get there?
And why? Yeah, that's so crazy. 8 years, somebody kept it and then went and put it out there.
Yeah, and I mean, that is probably the most debated thing. I've heard everything from a wild animal picked the money up and moved it, to it. D.B. Cooper landed in the Columbia, and then a dredge picked him, or a freighter picked up his parachute and then dragged his body, and then the money fell out, and then the river was dredged and the money was picked up in the dredge and then dumped on Tina Bar. I mean, I've heard a bunch of different theories for how the money got there, but I still don't believe there's one that makes sense yet.
Are you under the impression that he survived?
Yes, I am. I think I'm 95% sure he survived the jump. And even I interviewed someone for my show today, Arthur Friedberg, who is a U.S. currency expert. Tuned into the show to hear it. And in that even sort of changed my mind about the money being spent, because he was very confident that if some of the other money went into circulation, it would have been found. So he was confident that the money is gone. The money never went into circulation. So does that change my opinion on did he survive the jump? It does a little bit. So I went from being 99% sure he survived the jump to maybe now I'm 95% sure.
I was going to say, I think he survived, but the whole idea with the money that he thinks didn't go into circulation, I can't get behind that, because maybe it didn't go into circulation then. Maybe it went into circulation 9 or 10 years later. Maybe he found a way to launder the money through certain ways, through certain things. Maybe he invested in Mexico. There's a lot of ways you could explain away it, like just because he didn't think it went into circulation. You know what I mean?
Well, what he was explaining to me is that there are so many times where there is cash transactions done where the serial numbers are recorded that the odds that none of those bills would ever get flagged in one of those seemed impossible to him.
I guess I'm just not thinking about, I wouldn't spend it in large sums.
Right, but even then it goes back into circulation. So if you were just passing off 120 at a time at the strip club, and then it goes to Tammy, Tammy then buys a car, those bills get flagged, and one of those bills was a Cooper bill. I mean, it could have changed hands 6 times before that, but we would have found one bill in circulation that way.
So does he think that he didn't survive the jump? Is that reason the money's not spent?
This gentleman doesn't know anything about D.B. Cooper.
I got you.
He knows everything about money, but he said if he had to guess, he believes that he died in the jump, but he doesn't really know anything about the case. But what he does know about is money. I mean, his family, his dad and his brother, they literally wrote the book on U.S. currency. It's called U.S. paper currency. And the collector's standard is their last name. Like the Friedberg number is something that's referred to in collectors' circles all the time as a way to identify money. I
guess the romantic side of me just wants to believe that he jumped, he landed, and because the money didn't really mean anything to him, it was probably more of like what we've discussed before, the way he was willing to give it away.
Yeah, like maybe
just jumped because he didn't care.
Maybe he didn't steal the money or ask for the money for, greed. I mean, like he was just trying to get back at somebody.
Yeah, that's very possible. I mean, they asked him, do you have a grudge against our airline? And Cooper responds, I don't have a grudge against your airline, miss. I just have a grudge.
And it has to explain away some way that the money was there in 79 and that it was found in 81. So there's an 8-year gap that the money was there, but not being spent.
Right. I also
weird.
I've asked people about the condition of the money. Tom Kay did a bunch of work on how money behaves in water. He bundled a bunch of money together to see how long it would float. It doesn't float for very long before it sinks. He got, I want to say it was a stack of $21 bills, bundled them together with a rubber band, and put a little laminated card on it that said, if you find this, you can keep the $25 and I'll give you $100 if you just call me and tell me where you found it. And so he threw a bunch of these into the Washougal River reservoirs to see if they'll sort of float down, to sort of test that Washougal washdown theory. And the bills, only traveled like a mile or something before somebody called in to say that they'd found it.
So just a mile.
Yeah.
Wow.
Yeah, and Darren talked about it was like 19 miles away from the drop zone where that money was found. Yeah. Darren, do we know what type of whiskey DB Cooper was drinking on the plane?
No, I've been asked that before, and I can only assume it's cheap airline stuff.
I gotcha. What about, was he wearing a wristwatch of any kind? Do we know what kind of wristwatch DB Cooper prefers?
I don't know the answer to that. I believe he was wearing a watch, but I don't know the brand of it or anything.
That'd be pretty cool for that brand, whoever it is. Like, say it was Citizen Watches. To be like, yeah, worn by
the DB Cooper Special.
Cooper International Special.
Like
what about cigarettes?
Black.
What about cigarettes?
He smoked Raleigh cigarettes.
Well, there we go. We got something.
Yep, we're getting there.
Man,
slow and steady.
We've really enjoyed having you on the show, and I really enjoy your podcast. Please tell our listeners where they can find everything you do.
You can find the Cooper Vortex. We're on Twitter. We're on Facebook. We're on Instagram. And listen to my show. It's free. Wherever you download your podcasts at, that's where my show is. And it's an amazing show.
Absolutely.
It's incredible.
Absolutely. I couldn't agree more. I beg and implore everyone listening to this to go check out Darren's show. Darren, thanks so much for coming on. We'll have to have you back on.
Hell yeah. Anytime, guys.
Thank you. Expanded Perspectives is supported by you, our listeners. We make Expanded Perspectives free for you to listen to, but it definitely isn't free to produce. You can support the show monthly by signing up for Expanded Perspectives Elite. Just go to expandedperspectives.com/elite/. Or go to the website and click on the Elite tab and sign up for exclusive access to new Elite episodes every month, as well as the entire back catalog of every single Elite show we've ever done. That's over 220 episodes, all for only $5. Your monthly donation is used to pay for monthly data storage, editing software, music, sound effects, audio recording equipment, and research materials like books, videos, newspaper articles, and other restricted information locked behind a paywall. Also, if you enjoy Expanded Perspectives and you want to help us out, please rate and especially write us a review on iTunes or anywhere else you find us. Reviews are key to keeping Expanded Perspectives on the charts where people can find our show. Thank you so much for listening. We couldn't make Expanded Perspectives without you. And we're back with Expanded Perspectives.
Woo-hoo-hoo-hoo.
Man, I could talk to Darren all day.
Dude.
This show's so good because every episode he does, he has like a different author or somebody who claims that they knew DB Cooper or they were the relative.
Theories, different suspects and theories every episode.
And I can't stop listening to that stuff because the more, like you said, the more and more you find out, the more questions you have.
And the problem that I still have, and I told Darren off air, the problem I have with it is they all sound good. Like I can get behind them. I'm like, yeah, this one makes sense. And then I listen to the next episode. I'm like, oh hell, this one makes sense too. It's a perfect case study. He really is doing the work.
Yes.
And if you like, and like we said, look, if you're not into DB Cooper, you're not going to like that podcast because that's all it is. But if you're into it and you like all these strange possible suspects, man, it's just fun. And
do it. Go get in the vortex, man. You got to do it.
You got to check it out.
Right. Here's what I walk away from listening to him and talking with Darren is whoever this Dan Cooper was. I mean, this guy, he knew what he was doing. It was well thought out from not just the airplane itself, because he knew things that the pilots didn't even know, to the day that it took place. He knew that it was right before Thanksgiving, the night before, that, the A team, if it will, was probably off. They probably had the B team running the show that night.
They had me and you working the flat controls.
Exactly. So you could get away with more. He knew to ask for multiple parachutes instead of just one.
And different styles.
Different styles. They talked about him having a knife. Well, of course, a skydiver carries a knife with him, so you can cut
out of the trees.
Loose. I mean, he was prepared. He knew the amount of money to ask for that wouldn't be too ridiculous, like $1 trillion. He knows that's unrealistic. It's not going to happen. But $200,000. They happened to carry that amount at the airlines on hand.
Yep.
They could pass off. He was calm, cool, collected. He was like James Bond, just sitting there in the back, sunglasses on, having the flight attendants light his cigarettes for him. He tried to tip them. They wouldn't accept the tips. When he finally got the money, he tried to give the stewardess some of the money. She wouldn't accept it. They all went in the front.
She's a better human being than I am.
Jumping out at night.
They're going to think he had the money. Just take some.
In a storm. I mean, he was not nervous. So obviously he wasn't nervous because this guy was like a special ops or something.
That's the reason I believe that he survived the jump.
Oh, I do too.
It's nerves alone. It's like when you're not nervous, you don't panic. When you don't panic, you don't make mistakes. When you don't make mistakes, you survive.
I mean, he's acted like he's done it 100 times.
Mm-hmm.
Not a big deal. And so the story, they never found him. And like you said, it's romantic to think. I hope that it's like the end of the Shawshank Redemption where he went down to Mexico and he's just sipping on pina coladas.
Sand in his boat.
And sand in his boat. And he's got him a nice little girlfriend and he lived the rest of his days happy. But, who knows?
And see, he even brought up, and was telling us about the fella that's with the currency, right? And we were discussing it.
Yeah.
And I still don't know. I understand his point, and I understand exactly, and this guy knows more about currency. I get it. I mean, I have no idea. I'm a dummy. We've all established that. But it's just like if you were going to spend it, there's ways you could go about it. He could go to Mexico back in the 70s and spend American money, and it may never make it back to America in circulation.
I mean, there's people that launder money all the time. There's got to be ways. I mean, obviously, if you're just, using it here in the States, like Darren pointed out at a strip club or something, it's going to get flagged at some point. But
he does have a point that it's one of those deals that what if he never, if the grudge, it wasn't about the money. What if he took the money and then like that, you can't give it away. You can't do anything with it. You took it. But you took it to make a point. What if you didn't need it? You didn't want it, but you took it to make a point.
Well, like there are theories about it being an inside guy. What if it was like a provocateur? Because at that time, there were no restrictions. They didn't have any security on an airlines. They did this strictly to start mandating these new procedures. Like now, when you go to try to take a flight somewhere, it's like you're being processed for prison.
Well, don't they call it now? That was back then they added it called the Cooper vein, where you could no longer you wasn't physically able to lower that stairs while it was in flight.
That's correct.
On the aft of that plane.
I mean,
because of that one thing.
Yeah, I'm still a fascinating story.
I love the idea of it because I love to think of the cojones on this fella to walk in there and say, "Hey, I got a bomb," with his sunglasses on, looking smooth and dapper AF. And be like, bring me a Mai Tai, roll me a big cigar, and then I'm going to jump off back this plane in the middle of the night in a storm and take all your money.
Yeah, I mean...
And give me your phone number while you're at it, girl.
Well, the stewardess even said when he first passed her the note, she stuck it in her pocket. She just thought it was a guy hitting on her.
Yeah.
And he was like, ma'am, you better look at that note.
Right.
I got a bomb. She just thought it was Mr. Steal Yo Girl just sitting in the back seat back there, smoking
Just
Raleigh
chilling.
cigarettes. Turns out it's a international spy or whatever.
Sipping on a little cognac.
Yeah, no, it said it was like just whiskey, I think, or
What they
bourbon.
believe, some kind of whiskey that was on
Yeah, it was
there.
whiskey and soda.
But I would like to know what kind of whiskey. Like you talked about. Like like the watch. You were spot on. If that company knew, if it had been in the report like he was wearing a Citizen's watch.
Or Seiko, or Casio.
It
Yeah.
doesn't matter. And that was what it was. And you didn't make a custom, like, murdered out flat black watch and call it the Cooper Special or
Yeah,
something.
they call it the DB.
Shh. If I was a watch company now, I'd start saying that he was wearing my watch and make one now.
Yeah, just make it up. Right? Why not?
Works for everybody else.
You got to go check out his podcast, The Cooper Vortex. You can find it anywhere that you find podcasts, but it is amazing.
It's fun.
Very, very cool. If you have any stories that you would like to share with me and Cam, or you'd like us to forward over to Darren, please do not hesitate. Email the show, expandedperspectives@yahoo.com. You can follow the show on all forms of social media. Cam, what do you got planned for the rest of your week?
Hard work and clean living, baby.
I gotcha. Well, that's about all the time we have for this episode. Till next time, folks, stay out of trouble. I'm Kyle. He's Cam.
Peace, y'all.